I think great. Yes. Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone. This is a great test of our patience today, but it is Earth Week, and Earth Week needs to be celebrated by a wonderful conversation on sustainability. So this, I hope, has helped build the hype, which kind of leads in the theme into the theme for today. Just a couple of things. We are recording this session, so we can refer to it later, just to let everyone know. We will be going through Stephanie's presentation, and then we have allotted 10 or 15 minutes or so at the end to take your questions. Anybody who has questions, please feel free to type them into the chat feature at the lower part of your screen. We will be monitoring those questions. I have my colleague Dawn Ballon with me. She'll be helping me stay on track and reviewing the questions, and we again will be collecting those and asking them or posing them to Stephanie at the end of the presentation. So today we are discussing sustainability, and we are very excited to have Stephanie Vickers with us. Stephanie is a sustainability specialist for horticulture crops with OMAFRA based in Vineland, Ontario. She works with growers, the industry, and researchers to assess new practices and technologies that improve sustainable production in Ontario's hort sector. Her current work focuses on soil management, cover crops, and efficient nutrient use. She also has a keen interest in understanding how sustainable agriculture policies and programs affect growers and what to do about it. Prior to joining OMAFRA, she worked at Sebastian Farms, which is a vineyard operation growing about 1,500 acres of premium wine grapes in the Okanagan Valley in BC. Stephanie received her BSc in environmental science and her MSc in soil science from the University of Guelph. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Stephanie. Stephanie, please take it away.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for sticking with us through the technical glitches. No matter how many times you practice these things, like something will always go wrong. So like Peter said, I've been with OMAFRA as sustainability specialist for horticulture crops. It's been almost 2 years now. And when I came into this position 2 years ago, I have a very technical applied research background. And so I wanted to try to understand why sustainable agriculture was such a buzzword and there was such a big push behind it. And I have, in the last 2 years, done a lot of research and interviewed many people. And I wanted to share some of the sort of key trends and knowledge that I've gained through this. And I originally developed this talk for the Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Convention, which had a very high audience of farmers and growers. I've changed it quite a bit for today, and I'm sort of looking forward to talking to a bit of a different audience, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So when I have spoken about this topic, and I can't really avoid the word sustainable agriculture, it's in my job title. So when I bring this up, I realize that this topic is highly emotional. Whether that's good or bad, it's usually frustration and eye rolling and less so excitement when I bring it up. But I've realized that either way, people have opinions about it. And so before I launch into this, I want to start this dialogue by saying that sustainable agriculture is a complex topic with what seems to be a continually moving target. And in some cases, policy has gotten ahead of practicality, and approaches to sustainable agriculture have been led by ideology and not science. And although that is true, it doesn't mean that we can just sort of throw in the towel on this word. Sustainable agriculture as a theme really feels like it's here to stay, and there is massive opportunity for agriculture to have positive outcomes in this space. And so when I've asked a lot of people, what is sustainable agriculture? It lacks a consistent answer. It is usually an answer about the environment. It's rarely about economics, and it's very, very rarely about social and community issues. But I've pulled some definitions from some of these major players in sustainable agriculture. And I've realized that the definition that people give you, it really depends on the context and what they're working in. Um, if you look through these definitions, you can kind of see there's a theme of sort of environment, economics, and social concepts. And if I had to define it, I would probably choose the bottom left one, which is the SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education definition. So it's producing enough food and fiber to satisfy today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to do the same. And farmers who value sustainability embrace three common goals while running productive operations. And that's profit over the long term, stewardship of the land, air, and water, and quality of life for farmers, their employees, and their communities. And so it has this sort of triple bottom line concept to it, and it gives equal weight to all three of those. And I guess somewhat thankfully, I'm not going to try to define it today. What I do want to talk about is why is there so much buzz around it? Why now? And sort of who is driving this sustainability bus that feels like it's kind of careening on the freeway toward us? And there's this ever changing, constantly evolving entire ecosystem of activities that is shaping sustainable agriculture in Canada right now. And I'm going to go over um, this flowchart that I made. I'm going to talk about some of the drivers, but then there's a few of them that I do want to kind of launch into and talk about more in detail, but I'm going to go over everything first. So um, the environmental impacts and risks and disruptions, these are a very real part of agriculture, and they're lately being exacerbated by climate change. And so some agri-food companies see this as an external risk and are addressing this through things like participating in sustainability programs or initiatives, or making public commitments to reach carbon neutrality, or other approaches, which I'll get into later. Another driver is government policies and strategies. They are shaping this too. And I'm not going to be able to give the provincial, like OMAFRA's government stance on sustainable agriculture. I'm a very technical person. I'm bottom of the barrel. I don't work in policy. However, OMAFRA does have some examples of commitments that fits into the sustainable agriculture space. So a couple examples include supporting and updating the EFP, or the Environmental Farm Plans, support for the Lake Erie Agriculture Demonstrating Sustainability Program, also known as LEADS. We love acronyms, so I know it's hard to get through, but we've invested in two key actions in the Grow Ontario strategy. That one of them is building a soil database, and the other is modernizing soil surveys and maps. And we've provided support for the RALP program, the Resilient Agriculture Landscape Program, and then of course through AAC, there's been support through the Agri-Tech Innovation Initiative, especially through the third stream, which focused on energy efficiency. So you can see that all of these programs are targeted at the environmental pillar of sustainability, and that's just within OMAFRA. There are a lot of other activities outside the province that are having a pretty heavy influence on driving these sustainability themes forward. Within Canada, the federal government are currently developing the Sustainable Agriculture Strategy and also Canada's 2030 National Biodiversity Strategy. Other jurisdiction policies and strategies and legislation to consider in this space include the USDA's Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, and the EU Farm to Fork Roadmap, and the EU New Green Deal, which is a pretty big one. And Quebec has a sustainable agriculture plan as well. Next, another driver are consumers. So you do hear this a lot. Consumers are demanding more sustainable products, and at least this is what you hear in popular media. I do think that this might be overstated, which I will get into later. This other one I've sort of lumped into kind of all one, like all this blue theme. So there is this increasing trend of companies and financial institutions that are making public commitments to improve the environmental and social impacts of their investments and their lending portfolios. There's also this increase in demand for business to business sustainability data for something called ESG reporting, which I will get into if you've never heard it before. ESG reporting currently gives companies a competitive advantage in the marketplace. It's not required yet. And so I sort of, yeah, lumped these together to kind of follow the money, like it's good old fashioned business risk management. And I will get into those in more detail later. But I had to include this last one because it helps me keep my sanity. I also believe that there are farmers, there are processors, corporations, and businesses that have a genuine desire to improve their triple bottom line or their sustainability because of their ethics or because they believe it's the right thing to do. So, with that, I'm going to dive into a couple of these in detail, like I had said, starting with climate change and the environmental impacts on agriculture. So, this includes things like increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, changing precipitation patterns, changing pests and disease pressures, warmer annual average temperatures, or inconsistent and unpredictable frost dates. I could go on and on. And I pulled up some pictures here just because there was enough relevant examples in the past few years in the places that I've worked that I'm sure we all remember the top left corner picture. That was a picture of Toronto during the day in June when we had all that wildfire smoke from the Northern Ontario and Quebec fires that kind of sucked in Southern Ontario. And then in July of last summer, there was pretty intense thunderstorms and hailstorms that went through the southwest Ontario, and it pretty severely affected a lot of the processing vegetable crops. And then the bottom left is actually a picture from my own camera roll. So I worked in the Okanagan Valley in the grape industry for about 2.5 years. And when I got into my truck during the heat dome, it had registered at 57. It was not 57 outside, but my truck had just been sitting in the sun, and I just had never seen that before in my life. And I snapped a picture, and I guess I'm using it in presentations now. But there's been a lot of research done on the heat dome since it happened in 2021, and this was just from one of the articles. It said the heat dome was 34% larger and lasted 59% longer than a similar event would have without the effects of global warming or climate change. So it was sort of this statistically improbable event that still happened, and we all know the outcomes of that. And then also because I have come from the grape industry, I was just talking to Peter about this, but in January of this past year, the Okanagan Valley had this deep freeze event where it was less than -30 for a couple days, and it has killed all the buds on the grapevines, so they will have zero harvest this year. So even in the last few years, like you can see that there's these pretty severe and extreme um, climate events, and there's also this strange interconnectedness where um, the climate impacts agriculture, but then agricultural activities like fertilizer use and tillage impact the environment. And there have been some cases where there are companies that have seen enough disruptions in their supply chains due to these extreme weather events that is prompting them to address this through sustainability initiatives. It's not just how they want to appear sustainable, it's actually having like external risks to their business. And so this particularly is an area that I do see agriculture, there's opportunities for agriculture to at least contribute to solutions. Um, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, enhancing carbon storage in soils, improving water quality, improving biodiversity, all done through land management decisions. Consumers, I wanted to dive into this one a little bit. So I see this consumer preference and demand listed in a lot of media, but also even when I go online to some of these major agri-food corporations, they have these landing pages online for their sustainability initiatives, and a lot of times it'll say right at the top, like consumers are demanding um, more sustainable products. And undoubtedly, consumers have increased demand for sustainable products according to consumer insight surveys. So these were just a few that I had pulled from the last few years. Um, And there's some stats here, like 33% of Canadians willing to pay more for ethical and environmental sustainability practices. Some of these studies were even done during COVID. So over a third of consumers say they are choosing brands based on their sustainability credentials, more now than they did before the pandemic. There's increasing demand for transparency, and sustainability impacts purchasing behavior. So according to these surveys, that is true. Um, but when you dig into these more, you can kind of realize that when consumers, the average consumer, considers their choices from a sustainability perspective, the way that they define that is they focus on food packaging and reducing food waste. So they might not be and are very likely not fully aware of production practices that happen on farms that impact, different practices that could impact the environment. Also, and this goes for any self-reported survey, how people answer survey questions regarding their priorities or their thoughts on environmental issues or their willingness to pay more for sustainable products may actually differ from their behavior in a store. We all want to appear virtuous. We might overrepresent what we would be willing to pay for a sustainable product, but I have a hunch, and it's not science-based or anything. I also, just based on my own experience in the grocery store the last couple of years, um, I think that the current inflation in grocery store prices may have shifted these priorities, and I haven't found a consumer survey done um, more recently. So, regardless, agri-food businesses and investors are certainly behaving as though consumer demand is increasing, or at least that there's a competitive advantage to be gained from brands and retailers sort of differentiating themselves as more sustainable than their competitors, which again, I'll kind of dive into a little bit later. Okay, so this is the part that's totally above my head. But I've done a lot of research and I've interviewed a lot of very smart people, and this is kind of collating what they had to say. Um, the landscape in which businesses operate is evolving due to this increased awareness of environmental degradation and the importance of social factors like diversity and inclusion. And so this has changed the expectations for corporate behavior. Shareholders are more than ever looking beyond just financial performance when making investment decisions. Environmental, social, and governance, so ESG, are three non financial themes that can be used to inform the long term risk or return on investment. The rationale is that industries that are adequately managing their ESG risks will be less vulnerable to changes in regulations or society expectations and pressures, and will therefore perform better in the long run. To add to that, as of 2024, there are regulations that are expected that will require publicly traded companies to report on their greenhouse gas emissions from their operations and potentially from their value chains. And so this has caused many companies to react and try to address their scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And actually, since I had made this talk in February, there was an update on March 13th. The first draft of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board's Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards are open for public consultation. I think they're open until June sometime. And so this is that the regulations that we're expecting, the first draft is now out there. It's not legislated yet, but when it gets there, it will be regulated by the Canadian Securities Administrators. So here's a pretty good diagram of what scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are from the perspective of an agri-food processor or retailer. So scope 1 is that middle of the diagram, and it covers emissions from sources that an organization owns or controls directly. Scope 2 is on the left on the diagram, and it covers the emissions from purchased energy. And then scope 3, which is usually the largest amount of emissions from any sort of product or company, it's on the right, and it encompasses emissions that are not produced by the company itself, are not the result of activities from assets owned or controlled by the company, but it's the emissions that happen up and down the company's value chain. And so if you're thinking from an agricultural perspective, scope 3 emissions for any downstream value chain member means on farm emissions. So if you're operating at any point beyond the farm gate, your scope 3 emissions will include what's happening on farms. So on farm greenhouse gas emissions have now become a target for this accountability. And again, although it's not required for all businesses yet, sustainability reporting is considered to be a competitive advantage and does currently give corporations an edge. And I do have a note here, and this was told to me by one of the economics profs that I had spoken about. They said things like ESG, they're a meaningful starting point for businesses, but it's often packaged as sustainability, which is not necessarily the case. And ESG is often used for investors or by investors to evaluate whether a business understands its external risks. So when I'm doing my research and if I see a company that shows like, look at our sustainability initiative, here's our ESGs, like that's a pretty weak assessment of them understanding sustainability. Okay, so those are the drivers that have led to sustainability sort of being on everybody's radar. Um, that's who's driving the sustainability bus. The outcome of this is that it has led to an absolute onslaught of sustainability related targets and initiatives and commitments and programs. So I feel like I could have filled 10 slides with this, but there are many different approaches to this. Here at the top, I've kind of drawn squares around same kind of trends. There are company-led initiatives and commitments like Sobeys has Our Part trademarked, PepsiCo Positive, Walmart has their own, Loblaws has their own, McCain is pretty popular in this space. So there are these company-led initiatives. And then here at the bottom left, these are just a few examples of what I would call third-party verification or more generic sustainability accounting tools. That includes the SCI platform, which is the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative, Cool Farm Tool, which I believe is the Sustainable Food Lab, things like Vera, Field to Markets, commonly used in Ontario. And then there's these commodity or crop specific sustainability programs. So examples like Sustainable Wine Growing Ontario, the Dairy Proaction Initiative, the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and then the Certified Sustainable Seafood. And then there's more of these practice or philosophy-based certifications, which you might be familiar with. They've been around for a little bit of a longer time, like organic, fair trade, and the Rainforest Alliance. So this is a confusing, um, very complex, and potentially very costly landscape for farmers and really anyone in the businesses, in the agri-food business, to try to navigate. But particularly for farmers, regardless of scale or size or crop, like almost every farmer I've spoken to that is affected by these programs have said at a very minimum, the sustainability push means more paperwork for them. So right now we're at the stage where it's mostly documentation and data collection that is needed for these programs. And of course, this depends on the farming scale and the business model or the buyers. For example, if you're a market gardener and you sell your product at a farmer's market or directly from your farm, you may likely never be required to provide data or accountability for your on-farm sustainability practices, unless, of course, you're voluntarily doing that. If you're selling product to a large retailer or processor, the impact on you, if you're a farmer, will completely depend on what approach or initiative they're pursuing, like from the examples in my last slide, and then also what stage they're at in this continuum. So this sort of cycle that's on the right, it was developed by Lisa Ashton, who was with the GFO at the time. And we talked about this a lot. And so she had put this together and it outlines the various stages uh, or steps that companies tend to follow when they develop their own sustainability program or they join an existing one. And so it starts with benchmarking. So a lot of that data collection is in this step. It'll be in either step 1 or 5. So they benchmark where they're at now, they set targets for where they want to be, they join or develop their own program that has certain standards. They make investments in order to meet their goals, and then they do this accounting. So that would be like assessing their greenhouse gas emissions across their scopes. And then the final step would be reporting and disclosing, and then it all kind of starts again. So the major trends that I've noticed is that agri-food companies are at different stages of the continuum, and I would say that a lot of them trend toward the beginning stages. Currently, the focus for sustainability is only on environmental sustainability, and it is specifically on decarbonization. So there's a lot of net zero claims out there. And this is a constantly changing and evolving landscape. So I put together this in-depth case study to really dial into how different programs are affecting farmers. And I truly hope that nobody on this call works for either one of these companies. I got lucky when I did this the first time, nobody was there, but either way, the point, like, I'm not trying to drag either one of these companies down. I'm just trying to show how within the same crop, within potatoes, there are two different company-led approaches that have resulted in very different effects on farmers. So the processing potato industry is in the crosshairs of sustainability because the cropping system itself is hard on soil. It's a tuber crop. It's a hard on soil. But also it has very few but very recognizable large market influencers as processors. So I kind of chose two of these company-led initiatives. So one of them is Frito-Lay, which is owned by PepsiCo. So it would be the PepsiCo positive initiative versus McCain. And so the similarities between these two is that they're both part of the Potato Sustainability Alliance, which was created as a pre-competitive collaboration to standardize sustainability reporting in the potato industry. So I would say potatoes are many years ahead of a lot of horticulture crops in that they've been kind of under the microscope for a lot longer of a time. So they've had more time to organize themselves. Both of these sustainability initiatives have been benchmarked to what's known as the gold standard by the Sustainable Ag Initiative platform, the SAI platform. And so with Frito-Lay, their goal is 100% sustainably sourced ingredients. And this is according to their own internal framework, 7 million acres of land farmed with regenerative practices by 2030. Currently, growers are not rewarded, and it is used as a condition of contract. Their KPIs of what they would consider sort of regenerative ag, they have like a little bit of a soil health theme. Some of it has to do with water quality, water quantity, biodiversity. They have carbon emissions and farmer livelihood included. So they do have a little bit of a social aspect. And so I just took this snippet on the bottom from their website where they count regenerative acres if they demonstrate improvements in 2 or more of those following areas. McCain, on the other hand, they have a heavy focus on regenerative agriculture, and they claim that regenerative agriculture is a way for them to maintain a consistent supply. So McCain is an example of where they're reacting to in the environmental pressures in their systems by creating sustainability programs. And so they see one crop failure per year in one of their growing regions. And, it's either too wet in the spring or it's too dry during the summer, there's not enough water for irrigation, or there's pests or disease or hail. So they consider this to be sort of risk reduction techniques. And again, it's heavily, heavily focused on regenerative ag. And they have a framework, and I just took a little snippet of the framework. You can see at the bottom of the screen. Their framework is like a page and a half long. But I wanted to point out like the differences between how specific the McCain framework is for their KPIs versus Frito-Lay's. So just for an example, just looking at the first one, armored soils, preferably with living plants. So the way that they describe that would be over the prior 4 years, including the current season, fields on the farm are covered by living plants with an average NDVI 0.25 for all fields during the season and at least 30% of the soil covered by living crops or residue. So they really dial in on what they mean by each indicator. And then I also am sort of impressed by this framework because it's flexible. It allows for accommodation of farmers who are at different stages of adoption readiness. And it kind of bakes in the idea of having these incremental improvements through time. And so I think big differences in like why these ended up to be so like vastly different programs is that Pepsi has many crops sourced from around the world, so their program is not tailored to potatoes, unlike McCain, which they just work with potatoes. From what I can tell with Pepsi, the program is primarily administered through their suppliers who may not have the resources to effectively guide farmers, like pretty much talking about staff time. Um, I've heard from growers that it's a lot of paperwork requiring someone to enter a lot of data on things like tillage and fertilizer and water. They do have some collaborations and are using different tools to model emissions. But again, when you compare it to McCain, they have an advantage. They're only looking at potatoes. They're also collaborating with the Soil Health Institute, which has focused heavily on farmer outreach, education, extension, and they currently have this cohort-based learning model where they take 4 to 6 farmers and they take them on field demo days and they work through problems in smaller groups. McCain's has also invested in true trial farms with a third planned in order to test and validate the regenerative practices. They're also doing economic studies on the regenerative practices. They've recently partnered with Farm Credit Canada to trial an incentive program for adopting these regenerative practices, and they have done a very good branding campaign for regenerative products. I saw they have like regen fries at A&W, and that's kind of from McCain. So again, I'm not trying to drag either one, but it just shows you the total differences that can happen if you're a potato farmer and your processor is McCain versus Frito-Lay. So some future trends in this space. We are trending, thankfully, towards standardization. So companies through the science-based target initiatives, companies now have a standardized framework for setting targets for their greenhouse gas emissions and carbon storage in the agriculture industry. There's also movement towards standardizing reporting through the Global Reporting Initiative. Um, there's a trend that companies are going to be needing to move beyond just checking the box that a certain practice is done on the farm. The next step is measuring and accounting for the impact. So this trend moving away from sort of practice-based accounting to outcome-based accounting. And sorry, the GHG protocol has released draft methodology that allows companies to include these emissions from agriculture in their inventories. So there is sort of this movement toward standardizing a lot of this accounting. Again, regulations are expected to require publicly traded companies to report their emissions from their operations and potentially their value chains. So ESG reporting is currently voluntary, but it will likely become mandatory. And then there are some groups that are looking to develop national sustainability programs or initiatives that standardize things within Canada. And I hope that these things go well. I do think it's kind of a risk of being like another label in this giant label race that's happening. And of course, the scope or the focus is currently on greenhouse gas emissions, but more and more companies are looking at things like soil health and regenerative agriculture and biodiversity and land use changes. So the scope will probably widen beyond just carbon. Okay, so how can we prepare for this? I think the first thing is to recognize and sort of accept that sustainability is likely here to stay. And maybe it's not ideal and the approaches have not been ideal, but this is sort of the new political and corporate landscape within which we farm and we do business. Um, and so these next few points, they're a bit of a higher level. And when I did deliver this talk at Fruit and Veg, I encouraged farmers to have these conversations at the grower organization level. So I'm hoping that maybe this audience will have some new perspectives and that this slide can stimulate some discussion if we have some time at the end. So if you have yet to be affected by these types of initiatives, I think it's helpful to start to think about what you want from these programs and if there's potential to impact program design. So I put some prompt questions there, but things like, are farmers included in program design? Do they want to be included? What is the governance? Are there incentives for practice adoption, or are there options to ease the administrative burden? Are the approaches science-based? And is there enough flexibility within these programs to incorporate, um, to accommodate, sorry, a lot of different adoption readiness? And are the expectations of these programs understood up front? So, how can the industry be proactive and get ahead of this a little bit? I think the first would be to identify and communicate what farmers or growers or your stakeholders want from these programs, from a farmer perspective, typically. And again, this is particular for a grower organization level. And the second thing would be to evaluate your operations, and to identify hotspots, particularly with greenhouse gas emissions, because this will or might have already has, but it will eventually sort of trickle down as companies start to look at their value chain and their scope 3 emissions. Um, and of course, the next thing would be to benchmark your practices as they are currently. And an example of this is that the OFEGA did an environmental sustainability survey to try to benchmark, where we're at right now. And they conducted it last year, and I believe they did a press release on Earth Day earlier this week about it. And so these are just suggestions, and I welcome feedback. And again, this is a moving target, and I want to understand the challenges that maybe you're facing, um, in your companies or your backgrounds, a little bit more. So that is it for me. I would love if there's a little bit of time. Okay, there's a little bit of time for questions. And I might actually just leave this slide here because I feel like it's a pretty good one to prompt discussion.
All right, I'm just monitoring the chat function. Just a reminder to everyone that I'm looking at the chat and just monitoring for any questions from any of the participants today. Yeah, I see some people are typing. Actually, to get it started, Stephanie, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. One question that I've had the benefit of seeing this presentation twice now, and
Yeah.
it certainly gets better, and it certainly really rounds out my appreciation of this. But I'm just wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on what the concrete benefits are to producers for participation in some of these programs. You had mentioned something about, or one of the key points was the fact that it's a condition now for sales.
Can
Are
be.
there any other concrete and tangible benefits coming forward, not just from potatoes, but any other programs you might have seen elsewhere in horticulture?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I actually don't know, like for the condition of a sale, I don't think I consider that a benefit. I might like to me that's being used more of a stick where like the company has the power to say, um, like, yes, we will buy your product if you're following this or no. It is powerful though. Like it's a powerful way to get people on board. There are some sort of smaller experimental things that are happening. Like I know the Farm Credit Canada incentive program that I talked about with McCain. Farm Credit Canada is not just working with McCain. They have expanded that sort of portfolio of incentives for practice adoption to they have some livestock programs. I'm pretty sure the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is in there. They work with the 4R Nutrient Stewardship Initiative. I think they have another one for field crops, but they're pretty experimental at this point. And I think that, yeah, that's at least the farmers that I talk to, that's a major discussion around these programs is instead of providing incentives for farmers, they're making it sort of a condition of the contract. And I'm hoping that changes. But again, I can't really say like it will. I hope it does. I hope that companies can get a little bit more creative with incentives.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we have a couple questions here. They're pouring in. The first one, any initiatives out there to encourage farmers to adopt green technology such as electric tractors? And I might say that one of those programs could have been the agriculture or agri-tech innovation initiative. Recently, the intake is closed, administered by the Agricultural Adaptation Council, would be one area where there could have been technology, green technology funded. Do you know of any others, Stephanie?
Off the top of my head, I don't. There is I don't know who specifically asked that, but there is an ag robotics working group. They have like a website and everything. It's a pretty well organized group at this point. It's been around for a few years, and they stay very well on top of any sort of like agri-tech funding opportunities. And specifically for that person, if you would like to be involved in that program, I can send along the details. But right now, off the top of my head, I don't know of any.
Excellent. Well, we'll be sure to make that connection.
Yeah.
Another question. In the current modernization process for the environmental farm plan, there's an interest in incorporating or aligning with sector sustainability programs, but we know that these market-based programs are well advanced at this point. Any thoughts on the role of the EFP in connecting with sustainability initiatives?
Very good question. And it's one that I've thought about a lot lately, especially I'm involved in some of the like the light touch modernization of EFP. So um, this one's tricky. So EFP, I think it, I don't think it can be used as a standalone sustainability program because there's no sort of third-party verification. It's peer reviewed, and I think it's really valuable for that reason. Um, but it probably wouldn't withstand the same rigor as some of these, programs like Sustainable Ag Initiative that are out there. So it sounds like um, you know about the differences. I would say there's potential to align them, but there's a lot of questions around data governance, and security. Because I think farmers sharing their data, like if you want to try to align it with some of these programs, there's a bigger conversation to be had about, um, who is accessing that data now. But it's a really good question, and it's something I think about a lot. And we can chat later if you want.
Excellent. Well, we have another question here. Let's see if we can stump you again. Not that you're ever stumped, but do you have a sense of how many industry groups have actually completed initial benchmarks? And is this done through life cycle analysis type studies?
Another very good question. I work in horticulture, so I am trying to keep my finger on the pulse of hort crops, but I know that there's movement happening all over, and I work with colleagues to kind of figure out who's done benchmarks. So they're livestock, I would say they've been under the microscope a little bit longer. They have done a lot of work with life cycle analysis type studies. I believe there's some people on this call that could probably speak to um, their own projects, but yes, the ones that I've been exposed to where they're trying to benchmark themselves is typically done through life cycle analysis or life cycle assessments. And this is sort of like an industry standard, but it also aligns with what's happening in the EU through their new Green Deal. They sort of require these product environmental footprints, and they use life cycle assessments through that. And so if you kind of want to align yourself with the most critical or rigorous legislation out there right now, it would be with the EU. So LCAs are very common.
Excellent.
Okay, Sarah. Thanks, Sarah. I didn't want to. Sarah just typed, we are commencing a benchmarking project. Yeah. So LCA is the method that's used for that.
Awesome. All right.
Oh, and someone actually put in the chat, thanks, Janice, the Ag Robotics Working Group link is in there.
Excellent. Oh, it looks like Ontario Apples is also doing benchmarking as well.
Yeah. Okay, so
Excellent.
tender fruit and apples
Yep.
currently have a project to benchmark, but there have been some done by potatoes, of course, have done their own, and I don't think it's public facing. And then again, some other commodities and crops have done their own.
Okay, we are coming up to 1 o'clock. We got started a little late. Is there time for one more question? I'm just scanning the board. Looks like that should wrap things up. We have recorded this presentation, so we'll make it available to the participants to review later as well. They also can connect with you directly as well, Steph, for any follow-up. I believe
Yes,
your
absolutely.
your coordinates are in the presentation, and we'll be happy to share them with attendees. There they are.
Yes, yeah, you have them too, so please share. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
So yeah, well, that is a wrap on today. Again, apologies for the slight delay getting started, but Stephanie, you handled this with such grace and panache. Like you didn't skip a beat. I wonder if that's one of the key indicators of sustainability, is that
Yeah,
you can actually handle the stress.
the
And
tech
maybe
problems. Yep.
that's part of a social indicator, I'm sure. But we really do
Yep.
appreciate your willingness to join us today. I know my appreciation of the issue is expanding, and I'm sure everybody else's, is too. It's a great topic. It's a confusing, broad, diverse topic, but it looks like these are conversations and explorations that we'll be continuing to have moving forward. So thank you for getting us started on the this path to discovery.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so that wraps up this session. I will likely be sending out a brief survey to participants just to get their feedback on how the day went and the topic and so on. But again, I guess on behalf of all of us at the Agricultural Adaptation Council, thank you for attending. We will be in touch with some of the coordinates information and hope everybody has a very sustainable Earth Week this week. So thank you very much and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Peter.